Anyway, we founded this not-for-profit. It's called the Nutrition Science Initiative. It was going to be a nights and weekends endeavor. I have a colleague in San Diego, Dr. Peter Attia, who's an amazing guy. And they have now committed $40 million for our first 3 years of research, which is going to cover about 3/4 of what we need for 3 experiments. But these will be better done than any nutrition experiments that have ever been done before. Do studies that test them.
First I want to thank you for being a brave journalist coming to a bunch of docs. You do this all the time and to try and teach us about science. But I want to ask you about the relatively new science that I think is relevant to this, and that's around the gut microbiome. And so there's been a lot of animal work. There's some good work that goes on here that suggests it's powerfully causal for obesity and malnutrition.
Yeah, I think the gut microbiome work is fascinating, okay? But the thing to keep in mind is whatever it's doing, it's got to end up, if it's involved in obesity, it has to end up changing the regulation of the fat cells, okay? So there has to be somehow, whatever it does to the gut, to the immune system, to the bloodstream, however it changes the form of the nutrients we consume, it has to end up changing the regulation of the fat tissue. In fact, it has to end up dicking with insulin levels somehow, because that's what's regulating it. Okay, so it assuredly plays some role. And then the second question is what's cause and what's effect. So I can describe the very first experiment we're going to do. This is a consortium experiment that's going to be done at Columbia, NIH, Pennington, and the Translational Research Institute, a new institute in Orlando. And we're just going to take overweight and obese men and put them into a metabolic ward, and every 2 days out of every 7, we're going to run them. They are going to run them through a metabolic chamber to get accurate assessment of energy expenditure. At the end of 3 to 4 weeks, we could be confident that they're weight stable, and we know exactly how much energy they're taking in when they're weight stable, and exactly how much they're expending. So this is a pilot study. It's not randomized, just a pilot study to perfect the methodology and to know how to power the randomized controlled trial that follows. And then we're just going to switch them over to a ketogenic diet. And a ketogenic diet has about 5% carbohydrates. So you can think of it as a tool to maximally lower insulin levels. But we're going to feed them eucalorically. So they're going to get exactly how much energy they were expending, but with a dramatically different macronutrient composition. Okay? The reason for the ketogenic diet is interesting. If you look at how insulin responds, how fatty acid turnover responds to lowering insulin levels. You can see that as insulin goes down, the fatty acid turnover doesn't really change that much. And you can have the same curve basically for mobilization or oxidation of fatty acids, because insulin suppresses fatty acid mobilization oxidation. Then you get below a threshold, and it shoots up. And the problem is you don't really know where that threshold is with people. So that's kind of the logic behind ketogenic diets. The Atkins induction phase is you've got to get in here, and the way to get in here is just get rid of all the carbs, and you're pretty confident you're down there. Okay, so we're going to do that in this experiment, but again, if you believe that obesity is about energy balance, you match intake to expenditure, right, then nothing should change. Our researchers do not believe that they're going to see any difference in energy expenditure or fat mass. But if you believe that obesity is about the regulation of fat tissue through insulin, then they should mobilize fat, they should oxidize fat, they should lose weight, and energy expenditure should go up because the laws of thermodynamics. So energy expenditure is actually the primary endpoint. One of the things we're going to do is measure gut biota and how it changes. Once we can do the pilot study, which will take about a year, we will then go to a randomized controlled trial where we're randomizing subjects to a ketogenic diet or a low-carb diet that's not ketogenic to see if there's a threshold effect, and then a control diet that'll probably be the standard American diet. We'd like to also do a very high-fat, low-carb diet, but our researchers think it's already too complicated with 3 diets, let alone 4. In those studies, we'll also do gut biome research.
Is a safe level of carbohydrate intake? Does one need to go ketogenic, or is there, in your opinion, and how do you figure that out?
Yeah, it's a question, what's a safe level of carbohydrates for people? And okay, caveat, I'm a journalist, not a doctor, right, or a researcher. And the answer is, I don't know. Okay, I do know that one of the fundamental problems with how we've approached this is we assume what's that we want to give healthy diet prescriptions for an entire nation. And in doing it, we assume that what's healthy for lean people is healthy and works for obese and diabetic people. And one of the messages in this is that people who are predisposed to get fat are very different than people who remain lean. Okay, and the argument would be they are much less tolerant to the carb content of the diet. So a lean person could be perfectly healthy. I would say just don't eat sugar, and you'll probably be fine. I mean, if you want to not eat sugar and eat white bread, you're not in a world that I understand. But sugar would be the thing to get rid of. But if you've got a weight problem, now the question is, if you're 10 pounds overweight or 20 pounds overweight, then just cut back and see what happens. Don't have pasta every night. Pasta used to be something we had Thursday nights. And then with this change in paradigm, it became the thing we ate every night because it was low in fat and it was easy to cook and everyone had their signature pasta. So you just cut back and eat less, and a lot of people, that works. I don't think they ever get ketotic. But if you're obese or diabetic, or your patient is, now you're looking at it as a medical intervention. So you want to maximize the intervention.
Can you comment on if different types of carbohydrates make a difference, starch versus sugar?
Well, this is the point. So the starches and sugars question is an obvious one, because one of the counter-arguments to this is, what about Southeast Asians? They eat high-carb diets. They don't have they did not have obesity and diabetes. It was the Southeast Asians that drove a lot of the understanding in diabetes and heart disease towards low-fat diets, because the idea was carbs must be harmless. But they didn't understand that there was a difference between starches and sweets, and that sweets have fructose in them. And so you've got, in effect, two different phenomena going on. You've got the effect of the glucose and the glycemic index and the rise in blood sugar, and then you've got the effect of metabolizing the fructose in the liver. And in fact, in the 1980s, the ADA embraced fructose as a sweetener because it's got no glycemic index. So the glycemic index of sugar is lower than that of white bread. But the problem is they were missing the point that fructose is metabolized by the liver. And arguably, we did not evolve to dump 50 calories worth of fructose on our liver in 5 minutes by drinking a soda or a fruit juice. Our bodies never saw that kind of fructose load before.
So
You're next.
If you have a patient who's not obese, who's skinny, in good shape, do they need to even worry about this?
I mean, the world is full of people who are skinny in good shape and have metabolic syndrome or visceral fat or liver fat. You don't know who they are. That's the problem. But, you're describing most of us in our 20s, or at least most of my generation in our 20s. So the question is, had we worried about it then, would we ever have gotten to the point where we had to do dramatic things now?
Thanks for an entertaining, thought-provocative lecture. You started out saying you were looking for some exceptions to established theory. Let me give you some exceptions to yours to comment on. These are three populations we've worked with that consume very high carbohydrate diets with almost no obesity. One are aerobic athletes. They consume on a percentage or an absolute basis more carb, more sugar than almost anybody else. Second are the Amish, who actually eat a diet. They eat plants, but it's reasonable amounts of sugar and carbohydrate. Third are people in the National Weight Control Registry that have kept weight off. All these people eat high carb diets. They're lean. The thing they all do is very high levels of physical activity. So I would argue that if you're an inactive population, carbohydrate restriction is a great way to burn fat. Another way to burn fat is to exercise, and people that do a lot of exercise generally eat a lot of high carb diets. So I'll let you comment on that. And the second thing is, we tried this experiment in the Atkins diet. We had millions of people doing this. I don't think it had a very lasting impression.
Okay, well, let me save that last thought, because we'll get back to that one in a second. So let's start with our three groups. Aerobic athletes are self-selected, okay? So it's not a very meaningful, and again, we don't know actually what happens to them as they get older. One of the leading converts to this type of thinking is a guy I'm sure you know well, Tim Noakes, okay? Author of The Law of Running, one of the drivers in the idea of carb loading. Tim ran 5 marathons a year and gained 40, 50 pounds. And he just thought that was his lot, okay? And then he thought, geez, maybe I should try giving up carbohydrates. And he did, and he lost the 50 pounds, and he now is literally, has almost single-handedly shifted South Africa, and he's now studying ketogenic diets in aerobic athletes because he thinks you could perform better. So the question is, the problem is aerobic athletes are a self-selected group. You know, I didn't become an aerobic athlete because I tend to store energy as fat. Okay, I'm 220 pounds. I was 220 pounds, 240 when I played football in college. Okay, physiology is destiny, Jim, or anatomy is destiny. Okay, so if I'm on, you know, 6 foot, my brother was 6'5", and you could see every vein and muscle in his body his whole life. He became an endurance runner. I became a football player. Okay, he couldn't gain weight if he tried, and actually he is trying now, which is another story. And I couldn't lose weight if I tried. You know? So the question is, so this is a problem with self-selected populations. The same with the National Weight Control Registry. How many people go on and try to go on a diet every year? 30 million? 60 million? There's like 10,000 people in the National Weight Control Registry. This represents about 1/1000% of the people who go on the diets. On top of that, the National Weight Control Registry is something that was advertised in weight loss clinics and hospitals that use low-fat diets. So you self-select for people who lost weight doing what they were told to lose weight. And in fact, a graduate student, a med student at Virginia Commonwealth University Medical School, recently started what he called an ancestral weight registry. And in the course of about 9 months, got 4,000 people who had lost 40 pounds or more doing low-carb, high-fat diets or paleo diets, and it's equally scientifically meaningless. It's fascinating. But you can't learn anything from that. The problem with the Atkins diet historically, there's two ways to look at it. By the way, the Amish, I don't know. There are a lot of explanations. There are problems with all observational studies. It's all observations. You know, for instance, I mentioned there are epigenetic effects, intrauterine effects. As a mother gets, when she's pregnant, are we running out? We are out of time. We're out of time. And I have to talk to Jim privately. I'm going to lose my window of opportunity, right? Let me just finish this thought. There have been two ways to look at this Atkins diet phenomenon historically. One is, as I said, it was a conventional wisdom from the 1820s onward. It raised its heads in diet books, and some diet doctors got very rich writing about it. Atkins was by no means the first. But it's always been there, the idea that carbohydrates are fattening, and it continues to succeed. And you could argue that the reason it's there is because it works. But the problem is the medical research community has always perceived it as quackery. So I get emails all the time from people who say, I went on Atkins 10 years ago, I lost 60 pounds, but then my doctor told me I was killing myself. And back in '72, after Atkins wrote his book, the American Medical Association published a critique of ketogenic diets where they said they're bizarre and quackery, even though they were based on the physiological biochemical data. So the problem is, the question is, what would happen if everyone in the country actually got the right advice and the right feedback from their doctors and knew why they were doing it? Because also these things are perceived as diets. So people go on them, they lose weight in the Atkins diet, and then you go off them once you get to the weight you like. And this has always been a problem with people who studied it. But if the carbohydrates are literally fattening, it makes no more sense to go back to eating them than it would to go back to smoking cigarettes after you quit because you wanted to prevent lung cancer. But traditionally, this idea that if the diet worked, we wouldn't have an obesity epidemic has been evoked since the 1970s, an argument against it, but it's been evoked by doctors who have been doing everything they can to say it's quackery and to get people not to do it. And the other thing that happens when you do it is you become kind of a bizarre social animal. Actually, so two people I know who do it, because there's a link between obesity, diabetes, and cancer. Okay, so this is interesting, and that's known to be mediated through insulin and IGF. So two people who do it happen to be the guy named Luke Hantley, who's probably going to win the Nobel Prize someday for his work in cancer research, who's head of the Cornell, was at Harvard and is now head of the new Cornell Cancer Research Center, and Craig Thompson, who's president of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Research Center in New York, the most prestigious, arguably the most prestigious cancer research center. And Craig is interesting because they both do Atkins diets to keep their insulin levels low because they think that will prevent cancer. But Craig said when he became president of Sloan Kettering, he kind of stopped doing it because suddenly he's doing all these functions and dinners, and you don't want to be the weird guy eating the steak and, broccoli at dinner when everyone else is getting served pasta. So it's almost socially unacceptable to be the weird person who's saying no to everything and having a specific diet. So there's a lot of reasons why it didn't work, and we're done because we got to go. Thank you very much.
Very good.